In May 1873, several hundred men with shovels and pickaxes gathered on a remote Kansas homestead. What they would uncover in the next 48 hours would redefine American evil, not as passion, not as rage, but as something far more calculated and terrifying. A family business built on methodical murder. But the real horror wasn't what they found buried. It was what they found inside the cabin walls, dozens of bullet holes, as if people had fought back, desperately, violently, against what they suddenly realized was happening. The Benders were gone, but the blood on their floors told a story that would haunt Kansas for 150 years. They came to Kansas in May 1870 as simple farmers, or so they claimed. John Flickinger, a gruff German immigrant in his 60s with cold, calculating eyes, and his wife Elmira Meal Griffin arrived with a plan. Not a dream of homesteading, not a hope for a new life, a plan. They filed a claim for 160 acres of land in Labette County. But this wasn't random. The location was deliberately chosen, directly on the Osage Trail, the only major route for westbound settlers crossing Kansas territory. This was the main artery of frontier travel. Hundreds of travelers passed this spot every season. Merchants, families fleeing east, prospectors, settlers desperate for a fresh start. Each one carrying money, each one carrying valuable possessions. Each one, crucially, unknown to anyone. By autumn 1871, the trap was complete. Kate arrived first. In her 20s, beautiful in a way that made men lower their guard, intelligent enough to manipulate conversation. She claimed to be a spiritualist, someone who could commune with the dead, who possessed healing powers, who could divine what the future held. To a frontier widow grieving a child lost on the trail, Kate Bender seemed like salvation. Then came William, known as John Jr. to locals, a man in his late 20s with a peculiar quietness to him. Something unsettling about the way he watched people. Something hungry in his silence. And Elmira, the mother, a woman rumored to have poisoned previous husbands back east. A woman whose accent was heavier when she was angry, revealing that her broken English was often a deliberate act, a performance to seem less threatening than she was. Together, they constructed a modest two-room cabin and an adjacent lean-to on the property. A sign was posted, "Groceries and Lodging." To any passing traveler, it appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a humble way station on a lonely trail, a place of refuge. Inside, they made modifications. The front room was divided by a single piece of heavy canvas fabric hanging from the ceiling to the floor. On one side, a small dining table, rough wooden chairs, the place where guests would sit to eat, the place where travelers could rest their weary bodies and share a meal with people who seemed kind. On the other side of the curtain, the shop. Minimal supplies, beans, bacon, coffee, just enough to maintain the illusion that this was a legitimate trading post. But the critical feature was what the table's location concealed. The table was positioned directly over a trap door. Beneath it lay a cellar, 6 feet deep, 7 feet square at the top, narrowing to 3 feet square at the bottom, a pit designed with calculated precision. And when the Benders invited a traveler to sit at that table, when they offered the guest a seat of honor, they positioned them with their back directly against the canvas curtain, back exposed, vulnerable. This wasn't accidental seating arrangement. This was the exact position they needed. Kate would sit across from them, smiling, engaging. She would ask about their journey, their destination, their family. She would take their hand and speak in hushed, mystical tones about loved ones waiting on the other side. "I can feel their presence," she would whisper, her beautiful face lit by candlelight. "They want you to know they're waiting for you." And while the victim was mesmerized, while their attention was completely focused on Kate's words, on the promise of reunion with the dead, something was happening behind that canvas curtain. A shadow was moving. When the signal came, when Kate said the right words, phrases that meant nothing to the victim but everything to those waiting, the canvas would explode. John or John Jr. would burst through, hammer in hand. The blow came to the back of the skull, usually on the right side. It was meant to be fast. It was meant to be devastating. It was meant to leave the victim unconscious or dead before they could even process what was happening. But if the victim wasn't dead, if they screamed, if they struggled, if their body still convulsed, one of the women would finish the work. A knife, a throat cut with brutal efficiency. The body would fall through the trapdoor into the pit below, landing on stones soaked with the blood of previous victims. Sometimes they would lie in that cellar for days before burial. Sometimes they would be dismembered while still warm. Then, in the darkness of night, the body would be carried to the orchard or vegetable garden, a shallow grave, 3 feet deep if they were hurried, deeper if they had time. The soil would be disturbed, loose earth betraying fresh digging, but the benders would work the soil with care, spreading it evenly, trying to erase the evidence. By morning, it would look like just another patch of Kansas earth. The search for victim valuables came methodically. They would sell the horses, the saddles, the clothing. They claimed these belongings had been left as payment by travelers too poor to afford lodging. The pistol shots, more than a dozen bullet holes found later in the cabin walls, told a different story. Some victims had realized what was happening. Some had fought back. Some had died not with their backs turned in trust, but facing forward in terror, gun in hand, screaming as the bender's blade found their throat. Those people died anyway. Not everyone who came to the Bender cabin died there. William Pickering was one of the first to sense the trap. Pickering was a traveler passing through in late 1871. When the Benders invited him to sit at the table, when they gestured to the seat of honor, the seat with its back to the curtain, something about the offer made him pause. He looked at the canvas fabric. He noticed the stains on it, dark brownish stains that looked like dried blood. "No," Pickering said quietly. "I'll eat at the counter." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Kate's smile hardened. Her voice changed. When Pickering continued to refuse her hospitality, she did something extraordinary. She threatened him with a knife. Pickering didn't wait for a second warning. He ran. He reached the stables, saddled his horse, and rode away as fast as the animal could carry him. When investigators found him months later and asked why he had run, Pickering described the stains on the curtain. He described the way Kate's face had changed when he refused to sit. He described a feeling, an absolute certainty, that if he had taken that seat, he would not have ridden away. Another man, a Catholic priest named Father Paul Ponziglione, also came to the cabin. As he was being shown around, Ponziglione caught sight of something that made his blood freeze. One of the Bender men, he didn't see which one, was holding a large hammer, not a tool for repairs, a hammer of the kind used for killing animals. Ponziglione excused himself, claiming he needed to tend to his horse. He left the cabin and rode away. He never came back. Mrs. Fitz, a widow traveling alone, sat down at the table for dinner. She was settling into the chair when she heard it, a muffled sound behind the canvas, a movement, like someone preparing themselves. Fitz stood up immediately. "I've changed my mind," she said. "I'm not hungry." Kate issued a command, a sharp whisper through the curtain. Before Fitz could turn to see what was happening, she heard the sound of the Bender men stepping forward, heard the shuffle of fabric, heard the preparation for violence. Fitz ran. 2 more men came to the cabin seeking Kate's spiritualist services. They sat down at the table, but, crucially, they refused to sit at the seat of honor. They instead insisted on eating at the shop counter. Kate became abusive, openly hostile. The charm evaporated. The Bender men emerged from behind the curtain, and the customers immediately understood they were in danger. They fled. These people lived. These people escaped. But they lived because of luck, because of instinct, because of something, a stain, a hammer, a sound that penetrated the carefully constructed facade. For everyone else, for the dozen or more travelers who didn't notice the signs, for the families who trusted, there was no escape. We don't know their names. Most of them, we'll never know their names. That was the beauty of the Bender's location. The frontier was a place of disappearances. People vanished all the time, to disease, to accidents, to bad luck, to the wilderness itself. A family that went missing on the Osage Trail simply became another statistic of frontier life, another tragedy, another loss. Relatives back east might wait months or years before accepting that loved ones would never return. By then, the trail had gone cold. Between May 1871 and December 1872, at least 8 to 11 bodies were recovered from the Bender property. But historians believe the real number was much higher, perhaps 20, perhaps more. Many victims were never found. Many bones scattered by animals or buried in locations that were never discovered. What the searchers found was almost incomprehensible in its brutality. "Doctor, Alpheus York, a physician from back east, traveling to Kansas to join his brother, was found face down in a shallow grave with his feet barely below the surface. His skull had been caved in, his throat cut. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, was found in the well. No marks on her body sufficient to cause death. Historians speculated she had been buried alive, thrown into the well while still conscious, left to drown or suffocate in darkness. 8 more bodies were recovered from the vegetable garden and orchard. All bore the same marks: hammers to the skull, throats cut. Many were indecently mutilated, the newspapers reported, their language too delicate to describe genital trauma and desecration of corpses. The Benders didn't discriminate based on wealth. Some victims carried cash and valuables. Others had almost nothing. This wasn't about profit. This was about the act itself. This was about the thrill of playing God. By spring 1873, the Benders had been murdering for nearly 2 years. They had perfected their craft. They believed themselves invincible. But in May 1873, someone arrived at their cabin who would change everything. Colonel Alexander York was a Kansas state senator. He was not a desperate traveler. He was not a lonely widow seeking spiritualist comfort. He was a man of authority, a man of means, and most importantly, he was looking for his brother. William York, Dr. Alpheus York, had disappeared weeks earlier. Alexander knew his brother had been heading to Kansas. He had been told about a cabin on the Osage Trail, the Bender place, where travelers could find shelter and food. When Alexander arrived at the Bender cabin, something unsettling happened. He recognized items in the cabin that had belonged to his brother: clothing, personal effects, things that William York never would have left behind unless he was never leaving that cabin alive. The Benders saw Alexander's realization the moment it crossed his face. They watched his hands move to his weapon. They felt the atmosphere in the room transform from hospitality to barely concealed menace. Kate Bender, in what historians now believe was a desperate attempt to buy time, offered York a deal. She would use her psychic abilities to help him find his brother. She told him to return the following Friday night alone, and she would lead him to William's grave. York didn't believe her, but he knew he needed evidence, not accusations. He left the cabin and reported his suspicions to authorities. 3 days later, at a community meeting in the Harmony Grove schoolhouse, 75 people gathered to discuss the disappearances on the trail. They agreed to obtain search warrants for every property between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. The Benders were present at that meeting. They heard the decision. They understood what was coming. And that night, they ran. When investigators arrived at the cabin days later, they found it empty, food gone, possessions gone. An abandoned wagon with starving horses found miles away in the direction of Thayer, the nearest train station. But something else was waiting for them, something that had been hidden beneath a bed, sealed with nails, a trap door. Beneath it, a pit that reeked of death. The floor was stone, but the stone was soaked with blood, so much blood that it had seeped through cracks in the rock, through the earth itself, creating a smell so foul and so unmistakable that even trained men had to turn away to vomit. But the pit itself was empty of bodies. The Benders, methodical to the end, had moved their victims before fleeing. They had taken what evidence they could carry. They had left only blood and the tools of their trade. 3 hammers were recovered: a shoe hammer, a claw hammer, and a sledgehammer. When compared to the skulls of the victims that were later exhumed, the indentations matched perfectly. The Benders had been deliberate in their choice of tools, selecting hammers of different weights and sizes for different effects. A knife was discovered hidden in a mantel clock, a 4-inch tapered blade stained with brownish stains that investigators knew, with absolute certainty, was human blood. Over the next 48 hours, the ground of the Bender property would be dug up with pickaxes and shovels. Grave after grave would be marked. Body after body would be unearthed from soil that had, only months before, been tended as a vegetable garden. But the Benders themselves, they had vanished. There were rumors, stories told in saloons and passed between towns in whispered conversations. Some claimed the Benders had been caught by vigilantes and hanged. Others insisted they had been shot and their bodies dumped in a river. Some swore they had seen Kate Bender alive in Texas years later, running a similar operation in a different county. But nothing was ever proven. No bodies were ever identified as belonging to the Benders. No reward money, $3,000 offered by the state of Kansas, another $1,000 from Colonel York himself, was ever claimed by anyone who could prove they had caught them. For over 50 years, the Benders have remained ghosts, murderers who vanished without trace, leaving behind only blood on stone floors and unanswered questions. But what happened to the survivors? How did Kate Bender disappear so completely? And why did the authorities never find them, even when they were so close? Those answers lie buried in the next chapter. How darkness became method. When Colonel Ed York arrived at the Bender cabin for the second time, he was not alone. Behind him came county officials, deputies with rifles, and farmers armed with whatever weapons they had. They came to arrest a family. They came to rescue a missing doctor. What they found instead were objects. On the cabin floor, partially hidden beneath a bed, investigators discovered a locket. Inside the locket were two photographs, one of a woman, one of a child. Both were smiling. Both were dead. The locket belonged to William York, Ed's brother, the doctor who had arrived at the cabin 6 weeks earlier, seeking shelter and hospitality. Ed held the locket in his trembling hand and understood with absolute certainty that his brother had died in this room, that his brother had been murdered, that whatever happened next, William was not coming home, and he was not the only one. The Bender family was practical. That was their defining characteristic. They were not killers driven by passion or rage. They were not madmen acting on impulse. They were business people who had identified a market opportunity and decided to exploit it. The market was the Osage Trail. The opportunity was travelers. In May 1870, John Bender Sr. and his son, also named John, filed a claim for 160 acres directly adjacent to the trail. Not by accident. This was deliberate site selection. They understood that a modest cabin positioned on the main westbound route would receive constant foot traffic, merchants, settlers, families relocating west, prospectors seeking fortune. Each traveler carried money. Each traveler was far from home. Each traveler would disappear without causing immediate alarm. By autumn 1871, when Elmira, called Ma Bender by those who knew her, and Katie, known locally as Kate Bender, arrived at the cabin, the physical infrastructure was complete. A modest wooden structure, 20 by 15 feet, divided into two rooms by a heavy canvas curtain hung from the ceiling to the floor. The front room was public, where guests would sit, eat, and interact with the family. It contained a dining table and a small shop counter with basic provisions. Behind the canvas curtain was the private space where the family lived. But more importantly, beneath the front room, accessible through a trap door, was a cellar, 6 feet deep, 7 feet square at the opening, narrowing as it descended, with a floor of stone slabs. The cellar was the foundation of their business, literally. Kate Bender was the essential component of the operation. She understood something that most people don't, that spiritualism was the perfect disguise for predation. In the 1870s, spiritualism was a genuine cultural phenomenon. Seances were conducted in the parlors across America. People believed they could communicate with the dead. Grief-stricken families would pay mediums to contact lost loved ones. It was a form of hope in an era when death seemed arbitrary and senseless. Kate positioned herself as a medium, a spiritualist, a woman who could pierce the veil between the living and the dead. When a weary traveler arrived at the cabin, seeking shelter and food, the interaction would follow a script. John Sr. would assess the newcomer, looking for signs of wealth, noting whether the person seemed isolated or likely to be missed. Elmira would engage in casual conversation, gathering information. Where did the traveler come from? Where were they going? Did they have family waiting? Were they expected to arrive by a certain date? And then Kate would emerge. "I sense something about you," she might say to a widow traveling alone. "Your grief, the loss you carry. There is someone calling to you from the other side, someone who hasn't forgotten you." The widow would become transfixed, perhaps her dead husband, perhaps a child lost years ago. The promise that they were waiting, that they had not abandoned her, would be intoxicating. "I can help you speak to them," Kate would whisper, taking the woman's hands. "But I must conduct a seance. We need to sit at the table. The energies are strongest there." The widow would follow Kate to the dining table. She would sit at the specific seat, the seat Kate always offered, the seat of honor, the seat with its back directly to the canvas curtain. And there, while Kate continued her spiritualist performance, speaking in hushed tones about the voices she heard and the messages waiting to be delivered, the widow would not notice what was happening behind the curtain. We know details about the death of Dr. William York because survivors saw the evidence, because investigators documented the scene, because the story has been preserved across 150 years. William York was a physician. He had come to Kansas on the recommendation of his brother Ed, who had recently visited the Bender cabin and returned with positive impressions. William was traveling alone. He had money. He was far from home. He was, in every way that mattered to the Benders, the ideal victim. When William arrived at the cabin in the spring of 1873, the Benders welcomed him with the hospitality they had perfected over nearly 2 years of practice. They offered him food. They asked him questions. And when the moment was right, when William was seated at the dining table, his back to the canvas curtain, his attention focused on the conversation, Kate gave the signal. The exact words are not recorded, but it was something she said. A phrase, a sentence, something that meant nothing to William, but meant everything to John Jr., who was waiting behind the curtain with a hammer. The hammer came down against the back of William's skull with tremendous force. A physician's body is not so different from any other body. The skull fractures under sufficient impact. The brain is destroyed. Consciousness ends. But William did not die instantly. Or perhaps, more likely, the Benders wanted to be certain. Elmira appeared with a knife and cut his throat with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. Blood poured from the wound. It soaked William's clothing. It splattered onto the table. It dripped between the floorboards and into the pit below. His body was pushed or dragged to the trap door. It fell 6 feet into the darkness of the cellar, landing on cold stone already stained with the blood of previous victims. The Benders worked quickly. They removed everything valuable from William's corpse. His money, his watch, his clothing. Then they moved on to the next guest, or to the next day's work. William York was buried in the apple orchard behind the cabin, face down, barely covered with soil. When Cole Ed York later searched the property with an iron rod, he found him almost immediately. Between May 1871 and December 1872, the Benders refined their operation with chilling precision. They learned to recognize the most profitable victims, travelers carrying gold, merchants with quality goods, families with valuable possessions. But they also killed those with nothing, suggesting that the murder itself had become as important as the profit. They learned to dispose of bodies with increasing efficiency, the shallow graves in the orchard, the use of the nearby creek when they wanted bodies to disappear completely, the careful removal of identifying items that might lead searchers back to the cabin. They learned to handle the stolen goods methodically. Horses were sold within weeks to distant traders. Watches were melted down or sold to merchants. Money disappeared into the family's growing cash. By the time they fled, they had accumulated an estimated $5,000 to $10,000 in stolen cash and goods, a fortune for the time. But what they did not know was that their operation had become visible to those who looked carefully enough. William Pickering was one of the first to sense something wrong. When the Benders invited him to sit at the table, Pickering noticed something on the canvas curtain behind him, dark stains that looked like blood. He refused to sit. He refused the meal. He demanded to leave. The Benders' hospitality evaporated instantly. Kate became aggressive. The men emerged from behind the curtain with threatening gestures. Pickering ran. He reached the stable, saddled his horse, and rode away as fast as the animal could carry him. Father Paul Ponziglione, a Jesuit priest, arrived at the cabin seeking shelter. As he was being shown through the property, he glimpsed one of the Bender men holding a large hammer, the kind used for striking animals or for breaking skulls. Ponziglione excused himself, claiming he needed to tend to his horse. He left the property and never returned. Mrs. Fitz, a widow traveling alone, sat down at the table. But something about the atmosphere unsettled her. She stood up abruptly and refused to remain. She heard the Bender men begin to move behind the curtain, heard the sound of preparation for violence. She ran and survived. 2 more men arrived seeking Kate's spiritualist services. But they refused to sit at the specific seat, insisted on eating at the shop counter instead. The Benders became hostile and forced them to leave. These survivors lived. They lived because they noticed something wrong, because they trusted their instincts, because something, a stain, a hammer, a feeling, penetrated the bender's carefully constructed facade. But for everyone else, for the isolated travelers who didn't see the warning signs, for the families who trusted, for the merchants seeking shelter on a lonely prairie, there was no escape. In May 1873, when excavation began on the Bender property, the ground seemed to resist the investigators' efforts. Grave after grave was marked. Body after body was exhumed. By the time the search ended, at least 11 complete bodies had been recovered from the orchard and surrounding property. But there were also fragments, partial remains, bones that didn't match, pieces of skulls scattered across the garden. Historians believe the true death toll was closer to 15 or more victims, though some estimates suggest the Benders may have killed as many as 20 people during their 18-month operation. Every body bore the same marks: a crushed skull, the distinctive indentation matching one of 3 specific hammers, a cut throat, evidence of robbery. Dr. Alpheus York was found with his skull caved in, his skeleton showing multiple hammer strikes. John Geary, Red Smith, and Abigail Roberts were stacked carelessly in a single grave, as if the Benders had stopped bothering with individual burials. One young girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, was found in the well with no visible wounds. Investigators concluded she had been thrown into the well alive, left to drown or suffocate in darkness. When investigators opened the cellar beneath the cabin, they found the floor covered in clotted blood, so dark and thick that it seemed to be a separate substance from the stone. The blood had seeped through cracks, through the earth itself, creating an odor so foul that men wept and staggered backward. No bodies remained in the cellar. The Benders had removed them before fleeing. But the blood was confession enough. 3 hammers were recovered: a shoe hammer, a claw hammer, and a sledgehammer. When forensic experts matched the indentations on the recovered skulls to the heads of these hammers, they found perfect matches. The Benders had been meticulous in their tool selection, choosing different weights and sizes for different effects. A knife was discovered hidden inside a mantel clock, a tapered 4-inch blade stained with the dried blood of victims. News of the murders spread across America like wildfire. Newspapers from Kansas City to Chicago to New York sent reporters to document what was being called the worst family crime in American history. Photographers arrived and captured images of the excavation, skeletal remains being lifted from the earth, investigators kneeling in the soil, searching for pieces of the dead. More than 3,000 people descended on the Bender property over the following weeks. They came from neighboring counties, from distant towns, from as far away as St. Louis. They walked through the apple orchard where bodies had been buried. They stared into the cellar pit. They took souvenirs: bricks from the cellar, wood from the cabin, stones from the well. What had been a crime scene became a pilgrimage site, a place where Americans came to confront the reality that evil didn't always look like madness. Evil could look like a family running a boarding house. Evil could wear the mask of spiritualism and Christian charity. Evil could be systematic. Evil could be profitable. Evil could be perfected into an art form. The cabin itself was eventually destroyed entirely, not by the authorities, but by souvenir hunters, people who tore away boards and bricks until nothing remained but a depression in the ground and the stain of memory on the Kansas prairie. The Benders had created a horror so profound that it could not be erased by destroying the structure where the crimes had taken place. The horror lived in the minds of those who heard about it. It lived in the imaginations of people across the nation. It became a legend, a warning, a story that would be told for generations. But the Benders themselves? By the time the authorities arrived to search the cabin, they were already gone. Ed York reported his suspicions on May 12, 1873. 3 days later, at a community meeting in Harmony Grove Schoolhouse, 75 people gathered to discuss the disappearances on the trail and decided to obtain search warrants for every property in the area. The Benders attended that meeting. They heard the decision. They understood that their time was ending. That night, they fled. They left behind their cabin. They left behind their tools of murder. They left behind the blood on the cellar floor, a confession written in biology that would echo across American history. They left behind an enormous reward: $3,000 from the state of Kansas, $1,000 from Colonel York himself, a fortune in 1873. But no one ever claimed that reward. No bodies of the Benders were ever recovered. No bones bearing the marks of their murders. No graves with their names carved into stone. They disappeared as completely as their victims had disappeared. And the question would haunt America for the next 150 years. Where did the bloody Benders go? And more importantly, did they stop? Colonel Ed York returned to the Bender cabin on the morning of May 15, 1873, with 2 sheriff's deputies and a warrant to search the property. He had spent the night in town, arranging his evidence, preparing his case. He had the locket. He had the testimony of neighbors. He had enough to arrest them all. But when the deputies broke down the door, they found an empty cabin. The Benders were gone, not hiding in the back room, not armed and waiting, simply gone. All that remained was the stench of death and the evidence of their crime, the trapdoor, the pit, the blood, the hammers. But the family themselves had vanished as if they had never existed. The wagon was found first, 12 miles north of the cabin near the town of Thayer, Kansas. Horses stood half-starved, one mare so lame she could barely stand. Supplies were scattered inside, suggesting hasty packing. But what the deputies found that made everything clear were railroad tickets. The Benders had not fled into the wilderness. They had walked into civilization and boarded a train. The Bender family had split into 2 groups. Group 1, the younger pair, John Jr., whose real name was John Gebhardt, and Kate, actually Eliza or Elmira Griffin, purchased tickets on the Leavenworth, Lawrence and Galveston Railroad, heading to Chanute, Kansas. At Chanute, they made a calculated transfer to the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, heading south toward Texas. Their destination, Red River County, near Denison, Texas, a lawless border region where fugitives could disappear into communities that harbored them, where federal authority was weak, where a man and woman asking no questions about each other's past could simply blend into the frontier landscape. Group 2, the elder pair, John Sr., born John Flickinger, approximately 1810, in Germany or the Netherlands, and Elmira, Ma Bender, whose real name was one of several, Eliza, Elmira, or possibly others, made a different choice. They continued north on the railroad past the town of Humboldt, riding all the way to Kansas City, Missouri. From Kansas City, they purchased additional tickets to St. Louis, a major city of 300,000 people, a place where a German immigrant and his wife could become invisible, where no one would remember them, where they could simply cease to exist in the anonymity of urban crowds. The separation was strategic. If one group was caught, the other might escape. Different destinations meant different jurisdictions, different trails for different law enforcement agencies to follow. It was not the desperate flight of guilty criminals. It was the planned escape of people who had calculated their route. Within hours of discovering the abandoned cabin, word spread across Kansas and beyond. Telegraph operators sent messages to every town between the Kansas border and the Gulf of Mexico. Reward posters were printed with the faces of the Benders, crude drawings that captured something of their appearance, but not the precision needed for certain identification. $3,000 from the state of Kansas, $1,000 from Colonel York personally. A total of $4,000, the entire life's wages of a working man. Pauses formed in Kansas, Missouri, and Texas. But there was a fundamental problem. The American frontier in 1873 was vast, and law enforcement was a patchwork of local sheriffs, territorial marshals, and state authorities who often didn't communicate with each other. A man fleeing Kansas to Missouri could cross into a different jurisdiction where no one knew his name. From Missouri to Texas, he entered a region where the outlaw networks controlled communication and protection. Bandits, cattle rustlers, fugitives fleeing slavery and Reconstruction, men fleeing debts, all of them had established systems in the Texas-Oklahoma border regions where a new face could find shelter if they asked the right questions to the right people. Lawmen who ventured into these regions alone often disappeared themselves. One detective, according to later accounts, claimed he had traced John Jr. to the Texas-New Mexico border and discovered that he had died of apoplexy, a sudden stroke or cardiac event, shortly after arriving. But he produced no body. He collected no reward. He provided no evidence. His story survived only as a rumor, repeated in saloons and passed between towns in whispered conversations. And the $4,000 reward went unclaimed. For 150 years, no one has ever successfully proven they captured, identified, or killed any member of the Bender family. Part 3. The Legend of Kate, the Woman Who Would Not Die. Of all the Benders, Kate possessed something that made her story survive: mystery and intrigue. For decades after her disappearance, women traveling alone were sometimes mistaken for Kate Bender. In towns across Texas, women claimed to have seen her. "I know it was her," they would say. "She was older, but the face was the same. She was running a boarding house near San Antonio, taking in travelers." Some accounts suggested that Kate had established operations in Texas, similar to the Kansas Cabin, another boarding house on another trail where travelers could be killed and robbed. But none of these claims produced evidence. None produced Kate. The story that persisted longest was that Kate had changed her name, married a rancher or businessman, and lived a quiet life in Texas, her crimes forever hidden behind the mask of respectability. Other rumors placed her in Mexico, in Argentina, even in Europe, each story more fantastical than the last, each one impossible to verify. Kate Bender became a legend, a ghost story, a woman who may never have actually existed as described in the newspaper accounts, but who lived in the American imagination as the embodiment of feminine evil disguised as innocence. In 1890, 17 years after the murders, authorities received what seemed like a genuine lead. Two women traveling together in Michigan were arrested and charged with being Ma Bender and Kate Bender. The case created enormous national attention. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco sent reporters to cover the trial. Trains brought hundreds of curious onlookers to Michigan to view the prisoners, hoping they might finally close the book on America's most sensational unsolved crime. But as the investigation proceeded, the evidence did not match. The ages of the two women didn't align with Ma and Kate Bender. Their physical features, compared to the newspaper descriptions and drawings, were inconsistent. Their histories and movements in the years following 1873 could be documented in places where the Benders could not have been. Both women maintained their innocence throughout the proceedings. They were released without charges. Their lives had been destroyed by mistaken identity. Their names had been permanently linked to mass murder and dismemberment. But the actual Benders, wherever they were, remained free. Part 5. The Questions Without Answers. If the Benders did escape successfully, if they reached their destinations and disappeared into new identities, what became of them? For Almira and John Sr., what if they arrived in St. Louis, purchased property, established themselves as respectable German immigrants? What if they lived out their years in anonymity, their crimes forgotten by everyone except those who had been personally affected? What if they died in their beds, old and comfortable, never brought to trial, never held accountable for the murders? For John Jr. and Kate, what if the detective's account was true, that John Jr. died on the Texas border? What if Kate, alone in a region of outlaws and fugitives, used her knowledge of seduction and spiritualism to establish herself as something else? Not a murderer, but a respected woman, a business owner, a widow with a mysterious past that no one dared to investigate. Or what if they didn't stop? What if Kate, in Texas or Mexico, established a new operation, a new boarding house on a new trail, new victims added to the tally, new murders perfected beyond what the Kansas experiments had taught her? What if the Benders' criminal career didn't end in December 1872 with the last documented Kansas victim, but simply relocated? Historians and criminologists have debated these possibilities for 150 years. The answer is, we cannot know. Only years later, through genealogical research and detective work, did authorities piece together the true identities of the Benders. Almira Meal Griffin had been married before, multiple times. Court records from her past suggested a pattern: husbands dying from head wounds sustained in accidents. In one case, a husband had fallen from a horse and struck his head. In another, a husband had suffered a devastating blow from an unknown assailant. In a third, a husband had simply died at home under mysterious circumstances. All head trauma, all fatal, all resulting in Almira inheriting property and money. Was Almira Meal Griffin a woman who had perfected the art of murder long before the Kansas Cabin? Had she taught her daughter, if Eliza Kate was truly her biological daughter, the craft of deception and violence? John Flickinger, Pay Bender, came from Germany or the Netherlands around 1810. His actual nationality is unclear. His actual purpose in coming to America is unknown. No records trace his movements before he appeared in Kansas in 1870. John Gebhardt, John Jr., was even more mysterious. Some sources suggest he may have been Kate's husband, not her brother. Others suggest he may have been a stranger the family recruited for the enterprise. Eliza Elmira Kate Bender remains the most enigmatic. Her actual age was uncertain. Her actual name may have been different. Her relationship to the other family members unclear. Did she have prior criminal experience? Did she have a life before Kansas? Did she exist before 1870? Or was she, in some sense, created by the crimes themselves? The Benders were ghosts before they disappeared. Their real names uncertain. Their real histories unknowable. Their real motivations locked behind walls of silence and legal barriers that meant their psychological records, if they ever received psychological evaluation, would have been sealed. Part 7. The Mechanics of Escape. Why they succeeded where others failed. The Benders succeeded in escaping where most criminals fail for a simple reason: timing and geography. They fled before centralized law enforcement existed. In 1873, there was no national database of criminals, no fingerprint system, no photographs distributed to every law enforcement agency, no telegraph network specifically designed to broadcast criminal identities. If a man changed his name, grew a beard, and moved to a different state, he was essentially a new person. The Benders understood this. They understood that America, vast as it was in 1873, could swallow them whole. They also understood something else, that sympathy for outlaws was common on the frontier. In the border regions of Texas and Indian Territory, in the Mexican territories beyond, a person fleeing legal authorities was not automatically condemned. The unwritten law of the frontier was, don't ask questions about people's pasts, shelter your own, protect your own. If John Jr. and Kate arrived in a Texas border town with money and the right story, refugees from a failed farming operation, seeking a fresh start, they might find community support. They might establish themselves among people who actively resisted federal authority. The elder Benders in St. Louis could have succeeded through pure anonymity. In a city of 300,000 people, a German immigrant couple purchasing property and establishing a business was unremarkable. No one asked questions. No one investigated. They were simply new arrivals in a city full of new arrivals. The most telling evidence that the Benders were never captured is the simple fact that the reward was never claimed. $4,000 in 1873 was an enormous fortune. It represented 10 years of wages for a laboring man. It represented wealth enough to establish a business, purchase land, change one's life completely. If someone had genuinely captured the Benders, if they had positively identified them, produced them to authorities, proven their guilt, that person could have claimed the $4,000 reward and disappeared themselves. But no one ever came forward. The reward was offered. The years passed. Decades passed. More than a century has now passed, and still, no one has ever successfully claimed that they captured the bloody Benders. This fact alone suggests that either the Benders died without anyone knowing who they were, or they succeeded in becoming so completely anonymous that they were never identified as the killers from Kansas. The Bloody Benders represent something unique in American criminal history, a case so completely unsolved that it borders on the mythological. Other serial killers have been caught. Most of them eventually pay for their crimes, through trial, through conviction, through execution or imprisonment. Their stories have endings, but the Benders have no ending. Their story simply stops, abandoned on a Kansas prairie in May 1873, with trains carrying them into a nation too vast, too fragmented, too willing to forget to ever catch up with them again. Did they stop? Some historians believe so. They suggest that the stress of being hunted, combined with John Jr.'s death, ended the killing spree. Did they continue? Other historians speculate that Kate, armed with nearly 2 years of experience and a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate victims, may have established similar operations in Texas or Mexico. They suggest that murders attributed to other killers in those regions, murders with similar patterns, similar methods, similar signatures, might actually have been the work of Kate Bender. Or did they simply die, old, forgotten, and unmourned, under assumed names that no one remembered? The truth is, we will never know. The Benders achieved what most criminals cannot: complete escape from justice. Not through clever hiding, but through the simple fact that America in 1873 was too large, too disconnected, too fragmented to maintain an organized manhunt across state lines and territorial borders. They became ghosts. Not through supernatural means, but through the very real possibility that a person could walk away from their crimes and vanish into a nation of millions. They killed at least 11 people. They robbed them. They mutilated them. They buried them in shallow graves. And then they walked away. They were never caught. They were never tried. They were never punished. And the question of what became of them remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the American frontier.